everything was like manually configured as to where things lay. We went from like less than 10 servers to 80. If we fell behind, there was no way to recover.
That's terrifying.
It was very much the pace and the nature of the work that made it drain people in the way that it did. You could run the script in a dry run mode for every single job that a team had, and then it would say, all right, there is like a 99% chance that this 90 jobs are just going to work. I would much prefer people did a ton of prototyping, like with those, dry runs and all that kind of thing, or like just gather information about stuff and have that at their disposal, and then have like a more rough timeline and schedule for things, and then use that information to figure out the best way forward in the moment.
Absolutely. I agree. Today on Turn Stories, we've got Tom Elliott. Tom is currently the founder at OcuRoot. But before that, he worked on the infrastructure at Yext, where he joined as a senior software engineer, ended up as director of engineering, and oversaw a ton of their transformation. So we're going to talk about why they didn't use Kubernetes today and all the journey that happened along there and how they ended up where they did. But welcome, Tom.
Thanks. Great to be here.
So, all right, let's get right into it, because I was looking at kind of the trajectory of Yext and trying to put a couple of dates together. You talked about the decisions you made and the company. What I didn't realize is that Yext had raised their Series F shortly before you joined, $50 million on like $500 million valuation. And you joined, if I'm not mistaken, like the week that Kubernetes went to general availability. So you were at this like perfect storm of scale and like infrastructure churn in the world. Tell me a little bit about what it was like to walk into Yext at that point, and like, what did you see?
Yeah, so it was interesting, especially because at the time I was coming from a really small startup. Like, when I left the company before, there were like 4 people there. At most, they'd been 8. And then I joined this like 300-person company. There's now like a 1,500-person company. And it was interesting because there was a lot of stuff that was already there, and a lot of history already. But there were also a lot of practices that they were still trying to figure out and like sorting out the best approach for things. They weren't doing CI at that point. It was all like manual deploys from someone's laptop, which desktop at that time. Oh, everyone had desktops. They were like. You were considered really fancy if you got one of the trash can Macs back in the day. That's how long ago this was. It's funny you mentioned the GA of Kubernetes. That timing sounds about right. I hadn't put that one together myself. But at the time, Yext was using this orchestrator that then built in-house because that sort of stuff didn't exist. And they'd done the classic thing in that period of time of just hiring a bunch of people from Google, which was relatively easy for them because they were right across the street from Google at the time. So it was like, oh, hey, your commute doesn't have to change. Welcome aboard. So those engineers all went about basically rebuilding the tools that they already had at Google and being like, oh, I wish I still had this. So they ended up with a version of Borg that they called Khan. And I thought it was beautifully ironic that we ended up using Nomad because that is yet another Star Trek villain, but it's kind of a deep cut Star Trek villain, but still.
That's funny. Interesting. The desire to use your old tools is definitely real, and especially real in people who worked at Google. No offense to anyone who's listening who worked at Google. Cool. So when you got there, was like, how were things going? Was the scale, like, were you all handling the scale in a way that felt sustainable, or was there sort of cracks on the woodwork?
I think it was generally working well at that point. There was definitely a sense that people were starting to wrestle with legacy at that point, and there were like some things that had been around for a while that people didn't want to touch, but there was a lot of exciting new stuff going on. Like, I joined right when someone had finished up their internationalization project. So there was this whole fun internal framework for that. Many years going around trying different ways of doing front end. That was always a struggle until they adopted React. Um, and but yeah, it was like there was like what, six or so teams, relatively small, like 4 to 8 people. That was a structure that worked really well for Yext and actually kind of kept going. It was a really big deal when they had added another layer of management on top of those teams. Um, but like each team had a really well defined thing. They had a concept of owning your entire stack. So each team would be responsible for a product vertical, and would own database right to front end. So you had to do a little bit of everything. I joined a team that compounded that because we were doing mobile as well. So we were like, you know, um, back end database, all the stuff in the middle, front end, and mobile apps on the side.
Interesting. How many engineers were you at that point?
It was like somewhere between 30 and 50.
Okay. So even at that scale, it seems like there would be a lot of like either duplication or confusion. Was there how did that model work for you all where you basically had teams that had to own the entire stack? Like I could see the upsides, but it seems like there's maybe downsides to that as well.
Yeah, I mean it. I think it worked well because they were really good early on, making sure that there were consistent patterns and that there were common ways of doing things. They enforced a very small set of languages. It was a really big deal when they added Go as well as Java. They were very specific about, where you could deploy, what sort of tools you would be expected to use. Over time, and this sort of like was kind of there when I joined, but got better as it went. The onboarding process. It was generally understood that most people would be using the same IDE. They ended up gravitating towards JetBrains IDEs. And there was a big push to deploy code on your first day, which required quite a lot of consistency. And so the challenge of teams sort of doing things their own way or like diverging from that only really became a problem around about 15 teams. And when they started to introduce like groups on top of the team that sort of then had their own way of doing things, and the product started to get a little bit further apart.
Interesting. So was that growth from like, 4, 6, 8 teams up to 15 all sharing basically technology based on cultural norms? Was that the trigger that caused you to kind of go investigate something that wasn't Khan, or was there another trigger?
There were a couple of contributing factors. I mean, one of them was that we didn't really want to be investing all the time into Khan at that
Yeah, yeah.
point, and it was like one or two people were working on it, and that was kind of sustainable for a while. But as things got bigger, you'd have to dedicate more and more resources to it, which didn't make a whole lot of sense since there were options available. Um, and it was probably more around the 20 team mark when we started to see like the challenges there, because then you were getting into places where there were features that we were clearly missing that would have taken a lot of work to put in place. So we had a separate infrastructure team who were managing all the servers. Like everything was in a data center in New Jersey, and anytime they wanted to upgrade one of those machines, they would have to go through this whole dance. It used to be that they would actually have to change code to move stuff off of those machines and then change the code back to put it all back. And it's like everything was like manually configured as to where things lay. And, there was a lot of work involved in adding a new server or that kind of thing, which you didn't have to do very often when we were small. But, my time there, we went from like, less than 10 servers to 80 in one environment. And so that was sort of a pain point that we saw, and there were like tools that were put in place to like help facilitate those moves and all that kind of thing. But like we were itching to have something that was more powerful, but also a little bit more standard, so we could rely on either another company or the community. And we had a couple of tries at Kubernetes. The first try suffered because we were hosting our own stuff in a data center. This was like before a lot of the tooling that made that more straightforward for Kubernetes. So we really struggled to get the management aspect of it together and feel comfortable with that and being able to trust that these clusters were going to be reliable enough for us in that data center.
Really? What
Yeah,
was
and I mean this was quite a while ago. It was,
Sure, sure. But
yeah.
what did you hit? Do you remember?
It was, yeah. There were a few incidents where basically just like a whole bunch of nodes went down. Things didn't get moved around correctly, and then like we were doing some funky stateful stuff for some reason, so like we lost things, and the upgrade story was really the biggest challenge for us. Um,
Interesting.
yeah, I probably shouldn't have said that we'd lost things because I don't think we lost any data, but
Yeah, but you can have, I mean, this was similar at Slack where like, if you lose a cache, you haven't lost data, but you have lost operational stability. Absolutely.
yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a really great clarification because that was like we'd have things like RabbitMQ node goes down, you lose that queue, you've got to recreate it from the database, and that takes time.
Yeah,
Sort of, yeah.
absolutely. There's semi-stateful. We need a word for stuff that isn't like data loss, but really, really hurts when it
Heck
gets
yes.
rescheduled.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so there was that. Yeah, the upgrade path was a real pain. Like, and it's still not the easiest thing in the world to upgrade Kubernetes. Like, if you have it foisted
Nope.
on you by your provider and all that kind of thing. But we really struggled getting a good cadence down for that, which wasn't previously an issue with Calm because we just upgraded each individual node. It was pretty straightforward. So that we sort of shelved that, and then there was another project exploring using Kubernetes in cloud regions because we had a bunch of cloud regions um, for serving consumer data. There was like read only, API search, all those kinds of things. Um, and we explored that for a while. I think we tried to bite off more than we could chew with that, and we tried to basically like reinvent everything all in one go, which was unsurprisingly in retrospect very difficult. So we ended up. Oh yeah.
This might be skipping ahead, but let me ask you a question that might be a little disrespectful. Was this a problem with Kubernetes or a problem with the way you had deployed Kubernetes?
In the first case, it was absolutely about how we deployed Kubernetes. um, in the second case, I think it was more of a project planning challenge. It was a very big vision, and there was a lot of great things about that vision that we kept hold of afterwards. But the plan was like, hey, we're going to reinvent everything, and it's going to be the world, and this is going to be the best thing since sliced bread. And I'm sure that's a pretty familiar story to a lot of people. And so that again, it wasn't necessarily Kubernetes. It was like all the work that we thought that we had to do to get to Kubernetes at that point was sort of the big challenge. And we sort of boiled that down in retrospect. Had a look back over that project, and we thought, all right, well, what do we need to get something that's just what's going to drive us forward over the next 10 years.
Yeah.
And we kept hitting up against the lift of doing a complete Kubernetes migration involving containerization. Because we were running bare processes on servers at that point, and we were relying on having things installed on those servers. I'm sure a lot of people would relate to problems with image magic. I've heard many people complain about image magic at many companies because it's just one of those dependencies you end up with, and you've got to remember to have it everywhere you go. So there was a lot of stuff that was already set up on these servers. The responsibility was spread around, and by this time we had maybe a couple of thousand jobs running. At one point, I did the math and worked out that we had a higher microservice-to-employee density than Uber did, which probably not the flex that I thought it was at the time.
In retrospect, certainly not.
Yeah. So
So
Oh, go
Let me
ahead.
ask you this, because
Hmm.
you were, I love this model where you have like tightly aligned product teams who own soup to nuts the entire stack. I love a little bit less that's maybe those people had to think about the bare metal in a data center in New Jersey, or at least when I think about working there. Um, who who cared enough to go work on Kubernetes or keeping Khan upgraded, like driving these decisions forward? Because my naive assumption would be that any given product team doesn't care that much because they've got a roadmap and OKRs and a CTO breathing down their neck. Who is willing to go to bat for, like, we need a major platform shift here?
Funnily enough, the CTO, who was breathing
Really
down people's necks. We were really fortunate in that we had a few very, very technically strong senior leaders within the org, and yeah, a guy who, and I cannot remember if he became the CTO before or after proposing this project. It was probably before. He had been wrestling with these kind of problems for a long time. He had a big hand in both the previous attempts. Like the first one, the migration part was like his baby, and he cooked up a really good plan. It actually got us to a point where most things were running in Kubernetes, which helped us later on. And so he proposed looking at Nomad explicitly because it didn't require you to run containers up.
interesting.
And he made the leap that this was the big like slow down factor that was going to cause us problems, and just being able to effectively lift and shift most of our jobs seemed a lot more tenable.
Interesting. Very cool. That makes a ton of sense. You could pick Nomad. Like, you could make that decision because you have done all of this work with Kubernetes and sketched out, like, well, here's all the work and 90% of it's going to be putting stuff in containers. What if we don't do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there was like networks and all those other things, and the irony being that we'd effectively built something that was based on Google's internal tools, but the public open source project that they created diverged so far from that that we had to go and take a third party.
That's funny.
which,
I have
which
heard that about Borg.
yeah, it's kind of interesting because it's like there's also the time gap as well. Like Kubernetes is way more complicated than it was when it was originally GA. As I recall, it didn't even have deployments initially, right? It was like all pods that you were managing yourself in the first release. Yeah.
Yeah, deployments are a later abstraction because who could have known that you need to deploy software?
Yeah, who could have thought that you might want more than one instance of it?
Yes, I'm glad they figured it out, honestly.
Yeah,
Wow.
absolutely, absolutely. Um, but yeah, so a lot of the advantages of Nomad was that it wasn't trying to be everything. So you could add on console, you could add on Vault and all these other things to do the fancy additional bits. But if you just want to run a process, yeah, Nomad's got you.
So CTO makes this decision. Says, like, I've seen too much with Kubernetes. We're not doing that work. We're going to go to Nomad. We're just picking up Nomad, not the entire HashiCorp stack. What was the goal? Was it to get everything off of Khan? Were there certain services or processes that were more important? Like, how did you think about actually getting from here to the promised land?
Mm-hmm. So the biggest motivating factor for us was enabling the infrastructure team to do upgrades of individual servers easily. So getting everything in the data center onto Nomad was our primary goal, and we did have these additional points of presence, but we weren't too worried about the upgrade story there because it was you could do immutable infrastructure just drawing the grid pretty easy. Um, so we start off with the plan. Let's look at the data center first. That's the big thing, and there were. We wanted to look at ways that we could order the migration to be based on business needs. And we'd considered like, oh, okay, so we'll do the least important things first, as in like those few services that like oh, maybe they run a cron job for something that only really impacts, 30% of our customers. If that cron job doesn't happen, we can do it manually. We can recover this pretty easily. And then there's other things like, oh, there's you know, this service that provides a front end for a product that a very small number of customers are using. So, the risk there is much lower. And then like doing the most significant things last, like everyone relies on this. This is absolutely critical. If this goes down for more than 20 minutes, we're in trouble kind of services. So we thought about doing that, and then we realized we couldn't because this was in a data center and we did not have that much headroom. So, budgets being what they are, I think we were able to maintain a headroom of maybe 5 servers at a time. And around then we had 50 to 60 servers to worry about. So we ended up doing this like 2 to 3 machines at a time. And we would be doing direct migration of the jobs that were pinned in Khan over to Nomad. And so that had to be coordinated much more closely. So in the end, we created a task force, or what did we? I think we called it a task force. We might have had a fancier name, but and that was formed of like a bunch of people from my group focused on DevOps. It had a permanent member in one of our architects who was like really good at this kind of thing. And then we would rotate people in from the other groups. And we kind of try and schedule it so that we do the migration group by group. And because of the way Khan had grown up, we actually ended up with like dedicated machines for certain aspects of the product. So it actually made group by group migration kind of tenable because they effectively owned the whole of 2 or 3 servers each. The problem with that was that if we fell behind, there was no way to recover.
That's terrifying.
So it's like we've like scheduled this out, and we've said to all these teams, this is the schedule for when your people are on deck, and when we need to steal someone for a sprint from your team. Which, like, you say that to anyone, like, you're not going to have this person on your team for a few weeks. They're not going to feel good about that. But every time we, like, the first few weeks, we were like only getting like 70% of the way there, and then like we have an issue where like maybe we have to do a bunch of rollbacks, or we discover something we hadn't expected, so we got to spend time working on that. You can't meet your goal at that point. So there ended up being like this kind of semi mopping up kind of process. Like we had to extend some weeks, which pushed the whole schedule out, and kind of juggle things around a little bit. So, we were sort of forced into doing things in that kind of sequential way, but like it was very, very difficult to maintain pace and deal with those sort of like unmovable goals.
Yeah, that kind of pressure coupled with what is effectively exploratory work, like you have a process, but every service might be a little bit different, is that is difficult. What sort of things did you run into? Were there like particularly gnarly cases that, with the benefit of hindsight, you would have liked to have known about so you could keep yourself better on track?
The biggest problems tended to be where we discovered there wasn't like a particular package installed on the host, or there was a quirk of configuration that wasn't quite as we expected it. Like I think we had issues with like the number of available ports a couple of times. And anytime we discovered there was something missing on one of those things, we had to go to the infra team and then be like, can you get someone to drop everything to do this for us as quickly as possible, please? Because we didn't have low level access to any of these machines.
Gotcha. And this was stuff where you would discover, like, you'd move a service over and it was sitting there listening on a port that does not talk to the internet.
That was definitely a thing. I think some of the migration did involve like standardizing ports, but then there was like patterns where it would work fine in Khan, but the the convention that we'd set up of like, oh, you have to set the port number by passing in this particular flag. If like one service didn't do that, it probably didn't matter that much in Khan. But as soon as you move it over to Nomad and it needs to advertise, that all goes out the window.
Yeah. 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 Um, did you build tools as you were going through this to like catch common bugs, try and make it go smoother the further you got in the process?
A lot of it was scriptable. And that was one of the really nice advantages of having all of these conventions and standard ways of doing things, because we could just, for a large part, like sort of automate the generation of the Nomad config from the Khan config. We actually ended up having a wrapper written around the Nomad config to make it even closer. And so we had this sort of like additional YAML BSL for managing all these things, which I wasn't the biggest fan of, I will admit. Um, it did help with a couple of things. So that was largely automatable. There was also, scripts to move something over, wait till it came up, and then like report on a couple of common, do health checks, make sure all the ports are open, all that sort of thing. And we made sure that our monitoring was very, very good when we were doing this. So like if something suddenly went wrong, like it hit an edge case where it needed this, one package or config on the server, and then if it wasn't there, the whole thing would fall over. We'd be able to catch that quickly.
Got it. That makes sense. How did you think about these things are some of this stuff is largely automatable. How did you think about the line between what was worth automating and what was just better to do manually, given that you were going to have to do this, I don't know, it was 5.7 times per engineer?
Yeah, I mean I think the big thing was like figuring out once things were automatable in a repeatable way, how often you could batch things together to minimize human interaction. Because if like, one team has 100 services that they need to worry about, you don't want to have to run the same script 100 times. You want to be able to batch things together and like, we ended up like usually doing maybe 5 services to a single commit, which seemed to be a good enough size that you could effectively review it, and then like rolling back wasn't too big of a deal. But you weren't like flooded with all these different commits that needed to be reviewed.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of thinking about it, is like you will move at a certain speed. It would be, of course, there's some upside to having it all done tomorrow, but the risk is probably too high. So finding like 5 per gets you like the risk profile you want. I like that a lot. That
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah, and that was, I think that was a big part of selling it to the individual teams as well. Because if something goes wrong, they were probably going to be pulled in. If things went wrong enough. So like it's like, oh, we're doing a thing that might get you paged. This is what we're doing to try and avoid that and make it as easy as possible for you to help if you are needed.
Gotcha. How did you work with those teams? You're about to go rip their service out and maybe break it. Like, what kind of prep did you do with them?
So having a member of their team like on the task force was a big help, because that was someone who kind of knew what was going on, and they could sort of be the face of the migration for that team. But we talked about this plan for months ahead of kicking it off. And the like with this and sort of a follow-on migration that I might hint about in a minute. It was really important to keep communicating and like keep all the teams informed about what was going on. And at this point, we did like a bi-weekly demo at the end of every sprint. So it was pretty easy for us to slot in a video for the migration process to say like, hey, this is what had happened. These are some of the interesting challenges. This is what we're going to be doing next time. And usually I think when we had someone scheduled to come onto the task force to do some migration, they'd probably spend the sprint before planning it and just like double checking things and having an idea of what order they wanted to do things in.
Cool. That makes sense. Was there, as you went through that, you prepped all the teams and you built the schedule and you're going through it. How was your team's morale over the course of the project? Like, did it get better? Was there like a low point or a high point?
It ebbed and flowed. If we have a bad sprint, people are going to feel down about that. Getting it done felt good, but I think a few people did feel a little bit burnt out after that. And um, I, I like. I think that it was very much the pace and the nature of the work that made it drain people in the way that it did. Um, we were fortunate because after we'd done this migration to Nomad, like a year, 2 years afterwards, we ended up having to do something similar to containerize everything.
You did end up containerizing
We
everything.
did end up containerizing everything, and that went significantly more smoothly because we didn't have to do it machine by machine because Nomad helped us move things around a little bit. And that, from the automation standpoint, we were able to go through a process where you could run the script in a dry run mode for every single job that a team had. And then it would say, all right, there is like a 99% chance that this 90 jobs are just going to work if you run the script on them. This 10 have a problem. And we may or may not know exactly what that problem is at this point, but these are going to need more attention. So we were able to sort of pre-roll parts of the migration so we could see where the attention needed to be before it became an urgent issue.
That sounds huge. That feels like it's the kind of thing that would just totally change the shape of the effort.
Yeah, absolutely. It made it significantly more comfortable, and it also meant that we didn't have to centralize all of the work within one team. So we got a really nice kind of side benefit of like, okay, we had to work closely with each of the groups and each of the teams to schedule the work for them. And usually it was like between two projects, or they'd dedicate a couple of people to it, but they could do it how they saw fit. But it became a race. So we had a leaderboard. We had like very public list of every single team, how many jobs they'd migrated and how many they had left to go. And so no one wanted to be last.
I love
So,
it. That's
so
fantastic.
they were like incentivized to schedule this work and just knock it out. And um, it it was a little more, sort of upfront planning and prep work. But maybe we did a month of building the tooling, building the leaderboard, and all that kind of thing. And then we could just sit back and nudge people occasionally.
That's
If they
awesome.
asked for help, we could help. We could jump in. But it sort of became this kind of snowball community effect.
That's cool. That sounds qualitatively different than grinding through with the teams under high pressure. I mean, knowing what you know now, is there a different approach that you would have taken to the Nomad migration in order to get that same kind of vibe, for lack of a better word?
It's a good question. I mean, the having those that restriction on the servers was always going to be a big problem. It would have been really nice if we could sort of like dual run Khan and Nomad at the same time. And I think we talked about that with the infrastructure team, and they weren't entirely comfortable with doing it that way. What I probably would have done would have explored tools that would have allowed you to do that kind of dry run process, and sort of maybe like, you set up one server that isn't, has limited access. It's not going to be hooked up to the proxies or anything like that. It wouldn't be load balanced. You just have one server sitting there and then just cycle through all the jobs and try to bring them up in Nomad just to see if they can operate on that platform. And then you've got your list of like, okay, what needs tweaking, what needs fixing. Maybe we can move a few jobs around ahead of time before we start doing the machine by machine migration.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. That if you've got, everything's a feedback loop problem.
Yeah.
And if you can push that feedback loop to the, yeah, and if teams can help, teams can understand like this is broken and it doesn't seem like it should be broken, then you don't have to call them when the service is threatening to be down.
Yeah.
Roll it back.
I mean, there's another very no shifting left. It's like, the more problems you can identify and anticipate early on, when the risk is low, the easier a time you're going to have when it's critical.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I I don't think I caught it. What was the impetus for the Docker migration? You decided to put it off, and then you came
Yeah,
back to it like, well,
yeah.
actually,
So yeah, I mean, originally we thought, okay, well, we can run bare processes in Nomad. That's going to take a lot of pain away. Great, we've at least bought ourselves some time. And we kind of wanted to do containers, but the original reasoning behind wanting to do containers was it's slightly less work for the infra team, which would have made them very happy, but is hard to sell to the product engineers.
yes, it is.
Where's the benefit to me, they say. But also it would have given us more flexibility around, how you configure each individual job and all that sort of thing. There's always the lingering, oh, it's best practice. This is how everyone else does it, but try to ignore that. But the motivation in the end was actually a security audit.
Oh,
We were using CentOS for a while, and that got end of lifed. So we were like, all right, clock is ticking for us to change the OS on every single server so that we can pass this audit. So we've got a very strict deadline, and there's like a push to do it. You can sell that to the teams and be like, hey, if we lose this audit, we definitely lose customers, especially in sensitive industries. You could ballpark a dollar amount that would come to, but so the reason for containerization was, well, hey, we've got to strip out the OS and start again. So we don't want to have to do this like whack-a-mole with packages again. So let's just containerize everything and just drop it onto this new OS.
oh, that's fascinating. We saw something extremely similar at Slack, actually, where every 2 years we had to do an Ubuntu upgrade. And the question and the discussion with every team every time was, it's going to be twice as hard for you to do a Docker upgrade to containerize your stuff now, but it's the last time you have to do it. You think you're going to work here for another 2 years? Most of Slack is in containers now.
Yeah, absolutely. That's like knowing that is coming and it is something you have to deal with. Yeah, is a huge motivator. And for us, it meant that we actually had to get to this deadline. Like the Nomad thing, the pain of missing that deadline. I think we ended up going over by like maybe a month. The pain of missing that deadline was just, oh, we've got to continue to think about this thing.
Right.
Whereas the audit was a real push coming down from the top. Everyone could get behind that, and we actually ended up finishing a month early on the containerization, which was very
nice. Hey, there you go. That's that dry run script and having everyone. That's real. That's awesome. Very cool. I wanted to ask about your journey in this a little bit, because you joined as an IC, as a senior engineer, and on this, by the end of it, you were director of this group. What was your journey like over the course of this time?
It was actually more complicated than that, because I was not just hired as an IC, I was hired as a mobile developer, specifically an iOS developer.
That doesn't sound like this area of the stack.
Yeah. I was there for 9 years. A lot of things happened. So I joined explicitly to work on this one mobile project that they were working on, and then I got moved on to another mobile project, and both of those got cancelled within my first year. Or at least it was sort of like, we dropped them into maintenance mode, and not a significant thing for us to work on. So I get moved to working on the back end on the Pages product. That was when I started working in Go, fell in love with that language, still using it to this day. And as I'm starting to work on the back end, I'm seeing that there's like these frustrations of dealing with, all of these different services. And it was something that I never really had to deal with before, because I was either like building, singular mobile applications that stand alone, or monolithic PHP apps with Laravel. So I have to start like 15 different services on my local machine to be able to test one feature. So I'm like, all right, there's got to be an easier way of doing this. And a couple of people had their scripts that were like one-offs and all that sort of thing. So ended up like going through a couple of iterations of bash scripts to do it. That would like do like terminal screens. So you had like 15 segments of your terminal all spewing logs at the same time. And that culminated in a tool that would basically just, you would configure it to have the startup scripts for all of your jobs. You would group them together, and then you just say, "I just want to start this job group, keep it running, restart things when you change stuff." And within about 6 months or so, everyone in the engineering team was using it.
Awesome.
And that felt so good.
Yeah, I bet.
It was like there was always a bit of a separation between what I was building and the people that were using it. Whether that was because they were anonymous people on the internet. I used to work for a VPN company, so they were very anonymous. Uh, or like there were layers of organization between you and the customer. So, you had sales engineers, you had support reps, you had account managers, you had the product team. And so the only time you would really be guaranteed to talk to a customer was when they were very, very angry. And it felt so good to be able to just look to the person sitting on my right and see that they were using something I built.
That's cool. Yeah, it's a great feeling. That's really cool. And I can absolutely see how that would be more motivating than we ship the next version of the mobile app, and I hope these 10,000 people click this button more.
Yeah, exactly. So like I got a real kick out of that. Built a few other bits and pieces, helped with a couple of other people's projects. And the thing that really sealed it for me was that I actually ended up replacing that original tool that I built with Tilt, which not sure if you're
Sure.
familiar with that. Yeah, okay, cool.
Yeah. That's
Recognition there. Yeah.
Daniel Bentley, right?
Yeah. So
Yeah, I was like, I know Dan.
so Dan showed me a demo of Tilt very, very early on. I think they were like months into building this. He showed
Cool.
it to me on a bar at Gotham Go. I think it was like 2018. And I look at this and I'm like, this is a much better version of the thing that I built.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, so we spent some time figuring out what we needed. We entered a contract so we could like ask for a few additional features, including like running things not in Kubernetes. Uh,
That's one needs to.
yeah, we certainly did. And so, replace that tool. And I had to do a little bit of work to smooth that transition, but people were also loving this new tool because of like a few of the additional capabilities that they got. And that sort of sealed it for me that like, oh, so it's not just building things that like I feel good about the fact that I built it. There's also a world where I can just find things for people and make their lives better by facilitating their use of these. And I think that was noticed because we did sort of a bit of a reorg, and the one of the VPs at the time comes to me and just says, "All right, so it seems like you like building tools and you like helping people set up tools and all that kind of thing. Do you just want to run that group? We'll give you 3 teams." I'm like, heck yeah, I'm in. And that grew over time, added some responsibilities, shifted some things around a bit, but was doing that for about 5 years. And dev tooling, it's sort of my niche and it's what I love.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's such a cool story. I had no idea that you sort of like found your way to it at Yext. That's fantastic. All right, we're getting towards the end of our time, so I want to ask just a couple of quick questions, quick fire, do a lightning round. So let's start with fun and silly things. What's the most embarrassing workaround that is probably still running in production?
Um, okay, so we had an issue with basically making sure that everything was running the latest version off of the latest commit. Because CI tooling, it was like sometimes easy to miss doing a promote or something. So we basically deployed the world every night, and they're still doing that.
I'm genuinely shocked that that works. I see how it solves the problem, but that's awesome.
Yeah, I think it's the kind of thing that you could only get away with in the sort of organization where like deploying to production rapidly is kind of the whole point. And like so, you know, for years we were deploying like 200, 300 times a day to production. Um,
Wild. That's
and yeah, it was like small, quick iterative stuff, feature flags to control bigger releases. But because we kept up that cadence, like deploying the world overnight just to double check that everything was in sync, like was fine. The only kind of problems that it caused us were resource contention, um, and there was occasionally a situation where someone had was rolling something out in a not quite backwards compatible way, and they quickly learned not to do that.
mhm. Yeah. Interesting. That's very cool. Um, all right. What migration advice does everyone give that is actually terrible?
Oh man, you're asking me to have a controversial opinion. Uh,
Competition.
yeah. Um. So, hmm, I I think that a lot of people would emphasize the planning stage of things. And they would probably do like for any project, like people say, like, oh, plan so much so that your plan is perfect and nothing can possibly go wrong. Well, it's going to go wrong. Like your plan will change. Be okay with that. Like if you're doing a design for something, like when was the last time you look back on your design and had implemented exactly what you wrote down? Like it never happens. Like
Absolutely.
yeah, like have checkpoints, be ready to change things, be adaptable, and be okay with that.
Absolutely. I was getting mad about this because I'm like, no, this is so much of what we care about at Turn is like planning and shifting information left and migrations. And I absolutely 100% agree with you. The plan changes. That's the whole point. You need to constantly learn what has changed and what you're doing in the moment based on what you know.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I'm not. I don't want to say that planning is bad, and I don't think people should like aim to do as little planning as possible. Like I think the more you know, the better. But I would much prefer people did a ton of prototyping, like with those dry runs and all that kind of thing, or like just gather information about stuff and have that at their disposal, and then have like a more rough timeline and schedule for things, and then use that information to figure out the best way forward in the moment.
Absolutely. I agree. That makes a ton of sense. Um, it's 2025, so let's talk about AI. Uh, what would you do different if you had the AI tools of today?
Uh, oh man, I mean, I'm still trying to figure out how I want to use them now. That's the thing.
Fair.
I think that like using AI to help you generate communication is useful. So like just coming off the don't plan too much, but also you got to tell people when you're roughly planning to do stuff. So like communicating schedules, communicating like processes. I'd want to lean more heavily on AI to come up with not just summaries of things, help you draft stuff out, maybe come up with structure for things, but also like taking the same message and rephrasing it a few ways, because you've probably got to tell people something 7 times before it sticks. And if you can make it a little bit different each time.
Absolutely. I love that actually. I give a little talk to the product org at Slack about how to run big projects, and one of my pieces of advice was like you got to have a couple of different stories because everyone cares about different things. Um, but maybe more fundamentally than that. Like people get tired of you saying literally the same thing, but you have to keep saying the same thing. Try and get them to listen. That's easy for AI. I had not thought about. Um, cool. And last one, where can folks find you online if they want to reach out?
So I post most frequently on LinkedIn and Blue Sky. LinkedIn, I'm just Tom Elliott, two L's and two T's. A lot of people make the mistake of leaving out one of those. I'm also at telliott.me on Blue Sky.
Very cool. Oh, and tell me a little bit about what you're working on now, because you're not at Yext anymore.
That's true. Yeah, I left Yext almost exactly a year ago. So I'm currently working on a tool called OcuRoot, which I like to describe as a layer on top of CI/CD to help you manage large numbers of environments, to chain together all your different resources, so that you can have like much more complex behaviors, but automate them much more successfully. So in the case of doing things like the Nomad migration, in theory, we could have put together a plan, a plan that basically described all the relationships between each of the different servers, which ones were Nomad hosts, which ones were servers, which ones are clients, and the packages that you installed, and then create a map of all of those dependencies. So that first of all, you can visualize the structure of your environment, and then you can completely automate its creation.
Very cool. Definitely something near and dear to my heart, and I'm sure a bunch of listeners as well. So, Tom, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been fantastic. And hopefully you can have a couple of good conversations with folks about Nomad, Kubernetes, and what they should do with their CI/CD.
Sounds great. I had a great time. Thank you very much.